Here's something that might make you tilt your head a bit. The Catholic Church, maybe surprisingly, actually has a dogma saying we can prove God exists just using reason alone.
Yeah.
And that immediately throws up a really fascinating question, doesn't it? I mean, does our reason, our ability to think, does it always back up faith? Or does it, sometimes become a bit of a threat to it?
That's exactly what we're digging into today. We've got some really interesting sources lined up, mostly from places like Mente Ateista and Scientists Free from Religion over on Medium.
Okay.
And they dive right into this dynamic, the history, the present day, this kind of, tug of war sometimes between Christian belief and rational thought.
Right.
We're even going to touch on the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius way back and then swing forward to some pretty sharp modern atheist critiques.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive really is to get under the skin of this relationship. We want to unpack the main arguments, look at the contradictions that seem to pop up, and think about what it all means for how we approach belief and, knowledge itself.
So let's go back a bit. Way before the church formally said, hey, reason can prove God, we had Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, Stoic philosopher.
Right, 2nd century AD.
Exactly. And one of our sources highlights his writings, specifically in his Meditations, where he's pretty critical of the early Christians.
Yeah, I remember reading about this. Aurelius, he really valued that philosophical dignity, the calm, reasoned approach to everything, including death.
Totally. And he looked at how some early Christians faced death.
Yeah.
And he saw he called it obstinate acceptance as being driven less by reasoned serenity, which Stoicism prized, and more by a hope for reward, an afterlife payoff.
So not inner philosophical strength, but a future gain.
That's how he seemed to frame it, yeah. For Stoics, the goal was virtue, knowledge, achieved through logic, reflection. He saw the Christian approach back then as lacking that rational grounding.
And it wasn't just about death, was it? The source mentions he also critiqued what he perceived as a lack of sort of independent critical thinking.
Yes, that's a key point. He contracted Stoic intellectual autonomy, thinking for yourself, with what he saw in early Christianity as more emphasis on obedience, on unquestioning faith.
It's about where you place the value, isn't it? Personal inquiry versus accepting received wisdom.
Precisely. And the source brings up Bertrand Russell's later comparison to Socrates, always questioning, versus Jesus, often demanding obedience, kind of setting up these two different paths.
Okay, so fast forward quite a bit. Christianity, despite maybe Aurelius's early doubts, eventually found it needed to engage with philosophy with reason, right? To stay influential.
Absolutely. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century is the big example, bringing Aristotelian philosophy into the Christian framework.
But the source argues the motivation behind this is interesting.
Right. It suggests this wasn't necessarily some newfound love for critical thought for its own sake. It was more, perhaps, a strategic necessity.
A survival strategy.
Kind of. A way to, articulate and defend Christian doctrines using the intellectual tools that were dominant and respected at the time, meeting the culture where it was.
But it seems like that relationship between faith and reason was always, a bit tense.
Definitely. The article points to some really stark examples where the church actively shut down reason when it started questioning dogma.
Like Giordano Bruno, his ideas about an infinite universe.
Exactly. Or Galileo, forced to take back his scientific discoveries about the cosmos. It wasn't exactly a consistent open embrace of inquiry, was it?
No. It suggests reason was welcome, maybe, as long as it stayed in its lane. Supported the existing beliefs.
That's the pattern highlighted, yeah. Accepted conditionally. Shut down when it got uncomfortable.
And the article stresses that the consequences of this, of prioritizing faith over reason sometimes, weren't just intellectual debates. There were real human costs.
Oh, absolutely. Tragic costs. We're talking about things like the witch hunts, the persecution of so-called heretics by the Inquisition, actions often completely lacking a rational basis.
It's chilling to think about.
And then there's the role the church sometimes played in justifying things like European colonization, terrible massacres, the enslavement of Africans, often framed horribly under the guise of conversion. It shows the danger when reason gets pushed aside.
It's a really sobering part of the history. Okay, let's shift perspective now to a more modern critique. The article quotes Jean-Paul Sartre.
Ah, yes.
Inverting the myth of Christ, of a God who sacrifices himself so that man may live. In truth, it is man who perpetually sacrifices himself for the existence of God. Useless and harmful sacrifice. What's the core idea here?
Sartre is hitting on a key point for many atheistic thinkers. He sees that Christian focus on self-denial, on sacrificing earthly life and potential for a divine concept as actually limiting humanity.
Limiting potential.
Yes, and historically, this view argues that framework was used to justify oppressing people, making them serve a religious ideal over their own well-being or freedom.
So the argument is basically that Christianity flipped the script, turned suffering into a virtue, maybe, and questioned it into disobedience?
That's the essence of it, yeah. The article contrasts Aurelius's focus on rationality for a good life with Christianity's historical push for unquestioning faith.
Yeah.
It kind of asks, looking back over centuries of, well, sometimes intellectual suppression and oppression, did that choice really serve humanity best?
That leads us nicely into this central tension the article calls a paradox: God and reason themselves.
Right.
It mentions Epicurus's ancient challenge.
The problem of evil, right. If God is all-powerful and all good, why does evil exist? Reason keeps bumping up against these massive questions.
But here's the really interesting twist the article points out regarding the church's own position.
Which is?
On one hand, the dogma we mentioned. God's existence can be proven by pure reason.
Okay.
But then the article asks, well, if reason naturally leads to God, why do you need dogmas? Why do you need religious authorities to sort of ensure people reach that conclusion, sometimes even enforce it?
That's a sharp point. It implies reason alone might not be such a guaranteed path to faith after all. There's a potential contradiction there.
Yeah, it really makes you think. And the article lands this section with a pretty blunt statement. The truth is that reason never needed dogmas. Faith did.
Wow. Okay, that sets the stage. Now, our second source shifts gears a bit, looking at inconsistencies within contemporary Christian positions.
Yeah.
Particularly moral contradictions.
And the main example they zero in on is that contrast you often hear debated views on abortion versus views on gun rights.
Right. For many people looking from the outside, maybe even some inside, there seems to be a real tension there.
How so?
Well, you have this very strong emphasis on the sanctity of unborn life driving opposition to abortion. But then, often from the same groups, you see equally strong support for gun rights, the right to own firearms, even powerful ones, despite ongoing gun violence.
So the question becomes, where's the consistent application of valuing life?
Exactly. And the analysis in this source suggests something deeper might be going on. It argues that sometimes, especially in politics, these religious arguments might be less about sticking to core moral principles consistently.
And more about?
More about aligning with a particular political identity or ideology. The defense of gun rights, often framed in terms of self-defense or liberty, sits uneasily, logically, next to the absolute sanctity of all life argument used against abortion.
So political expediency trumping consistent ethics, perhaps.
That's the argument being made, yeah. That political influence, especially in the U.S., has become so tangled up with certain religious beliefs that it creates these, well, seemingly contradictory stances. It becomes about party lines, maybe, more than just the stated religious principles.
And what are the consequences of these kinds of logical inconsistencies, according to the source?
Well, the main argument is that it can seriously erode the moral authority of the leaders and groups involved. It can look like hypocrisy, breed distrust, when principles seem applied selectively based on the issue or political convenience.
And does that impact people's view of faith itself?
The source suggests it absolutely can. These contradictions can widen the gap between religious claims and how people see the world, potentially pushing people away from faith or making them seriously doubt its relevance or coherence today.
So the danger is Christianity becoming just another political bloc.
That's the concern raised, yes.
Yeah.
That it risks looking like it's more about power and politics than about clear, consistent moral guidance.
Okay, let's bring in our third source. This one involves a major figure in 20th century philosophy, Bertrand Russell.
Ah, yes. Why I Am Not a Christian, a hugely influential essay.
And the article focuses on his idea of the intellectual descent of arguments for God. What did he mean by that?
Russell basically observed a historical pattern. He argued that the arguments used to prove God's existence had actually gotten, well, weaker and more subjective over time.
Weaker? Oh.
Initially, he said theists used arguments they thought were solid, objective, based on metaphysics or science. Like the cosmological argument that, everything needs a cause, so the universe needs a first cause, which is God. Or the teleological argument. Look at the design in nature, the complexity. It must have a designer.
The watchmaker argument, basically.
Kind of, yeah. But Russell pointed out that as science advanced, these arguments ran into trouble. The Big Bang Theory complicated that simple first cause idea.
Right. What caused the cause? Or was there a before?
Exactly. And Darwin's theory of evolution provided a powerful natural explanation for the complexity and apparent design of life without needing a supernatural designer.
So science chipped away at those older arguments.
It did. Plus the ongoing problem of suffering, random disasters, that made the idea of an all-powerful, all-good designer harder to square with reality for many. So Russell said the arguments shifted.
Shifted towards what?
Towards moral arguments like we need God for morality, or emotional arguments, appeals to personal experience. Russell saw these as much less objective, more subjective, and basically assigned that the stronger earlier arguments weren't holding up anymore. An intellectual dissent.
Okay. And the article then connects this to modern apologetics, people like William Lane Craig or Alvin Plantinga.
Yes, these are contemporary philosophers and theologians who try to update and defend those traditional arguments.
But what's the article's take on these modern versions? Are they stronger?
The article acknowledges the effort, but is still critical. It argues that even these reformulated arguments, like the Kalam cosmological argument, a sophisticated version of the first cause idea, still rely on premises that are debatable or unproven themselves.
And the fine-tuning argument, the one about the universe being perfectly set up for life.
Right. The article mentions that while it sounds compelling, there are alternative scientific ideas, like the multiverse hypothesis or anthropic reasoning, the idea that, well, of course we observe conditions suitable for life, otherwise we wouldn't be here to observe them. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily require a tuner.
What about the moral argument, that objective morals prove God?
The article counters that by pointing to evidence from evolutionary biology, psychology, anthropology, suggesting morality can arise naturally from social needs and evolutionary processes, we don't necessarily need a divine lawgiver for ethical systems to develop.
So the overall conclusion from this source?
It basically says that while modern apologetics are often complex, they still tend to lack solid empirical grounding. And in that sense, they kind of support Russell's original point about this intellectual dissent, a move away from arguments aiming for objective proof towards ones that are maybe more philosophical or harder to test empirically.
This seems like a good point to bring in our fourth source, which gets really specific. It lists 10 examples of what it calls flawed Christian reasoning. Let's maybe touch on a few. Number one is the watchmaker fallacy.
The classic. Find a watch, assume a watchmaker. See complex nature, assume a divine maker.
The flaw being?
It ignores natural selection. Biological complexity arises through evolution, reproduction, mutation, selection over eons. It's not like an inanimate object being assembled. Living things reproduce and change. Watches don't. It's a false analogy.
You okay? Then there's the light bulb and the sun analogy.
Another flawed comparison. Yeah. Just because both give off light doesn't mean they have the same kind of origin. One's engineered, one's nuclear fusion. Sharing one property doesn't mean they share a cause. Like saying a toy car and a real car are the same.
Right. How about the car in the junkyard? I hear this one a lot.
Yeah, the idea that believing in evolution is like believing a tornado could assemble a Boeing 747 from junkyard.
It completely misrepresents evolution, doesn't it?
Totally. Evolution isn't pure random chance like a tornado. It's gradual selection acting on variations over generations. Again, cars don't reproduce or evolve. Living things do. It's just not comparable.
Okay, the castle argument.
Similar idea, comparing the universe to a designed castle. But a castle is static, built for a purpose. The universe, as science sees it, is dynamic, evolving, self-organizing according to physical laws. The need for an external builder isn't as obvious.
Next, atheists have faith too.
This confuses different meanings of faith. Religious faith often means belief without strong evidence. Atheism is generally a lack of belief in gods due to a perceived lack of evidence. It's not a positive belief system requiring its own leap of faith in the same way. Rejecting a claim isn't the same as making one.
Okay, Pascal's wager, bet on God just in case.
The article points out big problems. Can you really choose to believe something sincerely just as a bet? And which God do you bet on? There are thousands. It ignores all the other possibilities. Plus, it feels quite strategic, not like genuine conviction.
Number 7, morality comes from God.
But morality clearly exists in non-religious societies, and even predates modern religions. We have secular ethics. History shows moral codes change. The Force uses a funny thought experiment, Eric the God-eating magic penguin, to show you can't argue something exists just because you can't disprove it.
Which leads to the next one, the argument from ignorance.
Exactly. You can't prove God doesn't exist, therefore he does. That's a basic logical fallacy. The burden of proof is on the person making the claim. You can't prove Zeus doesn't exist either, but that doesn't make him real.
Number 9. Evolution is just a theory.
This plays on the everyday meaning of theory as just a guess. In science, a theory, like the theory of gravity or germ theory, is a massive, well-supported explanation based on tons of evidence. Calling evolution just a theory doesn't actually undermine its scientific standing at all.
And the last one listed here, the Bible is proof of God.
That's circular reasoning, using the book itself to prove the claims made within the book. Like using a Harry Potter book to prove wizards are real, the premise assumes the conclusion.
The article even adds one more, the AI and the toaster argument. What's that?
It's another bad analogy. Like an AI claiming it evolved from a toaster. It fails because AI and toasters don't reproduce, mutate, or undergo natural selection. They lack the core mechanisms of biological evolution entirely. It fundamentally misunderstands how evolution works.
That list covers a lot of common ground. The article also tackles a related misconception about evolution itself, the whole "we evolved from monkeys" idea.
Right, that very linear, ladder-like picture. It's wrong.
So what's the accurate picture?
It's a branching tree.
Yeah.
Humans and modern monkeys share a common ancestor that lived millions of years ago, but then our evolutionary lineages diverged. We went down one branch, they went down others. We didn't evolve from the monkeys we see today.
Why does that simple linear idea persist so strongly?
Probably because it's, well, simpler to grasp than a complex branching tree. And maybe some discomfort with acknowledging that deep shared ancestry, that interconnectedness of life.
So wrapping up this source, the core argument seems to be that many of these flawed lines of reasoning hang around because ultimately religion tends to value faith over logical consistency or evidence.
Exactly. While Christianity has tried to integrate logic, like with Aquinas, when push comes to shove, belief often takes precedence. The article asks that pointed question: how come those stupid logic errors still persist?
And the suggested answer:
it touches on how religious influence, maybe in education or culture, can sometimes discourage critical thinking about core doctrines. Maybe a culture of fear about questioning. And it ends by saying intellectual progress often depends on people having the courage to challenge accepted ideas, even sacred ones.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really journeyed through a complex landscape, haven't we?
Definitely. From Marcus Aurelius' early suspicion of Christian rationality.
To the church's later, sometimes strategic, sometimes suppressive relationship with logic.
The apparent contradictions highlighted in modern debates, like the abortion and gun rights issue.
And then the whole atheistic critique, Sartre's view, Russell's intellectual dissent, and all those specific logical fallacies.
I think the big aha moment, if there is one, is just how not straightforward this relationship between faith and reason has been or is. It's messy, dynamic, full of tension.
Yeah, it's not as simple they support each other or they oppose each other. It's much more nuanced with real historical weight and ongoing relevance.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Considering this whole historical path, the push and pull between reason and faith, the critiques like Russell's about arguments maybe weakening over time, what does the ongoing reliance on faith, sometimes seemingly over reason, mean for us, for how we understand things individually and maybe for societal progress?
Is that intellectual dissent. Russell talked about actually pointing to something deeper happening in how we approach knowledge and belief in our modern scientific world.
Lots to think about. We definitely encourage you to explore folks like Marcus Aurelius, Bertrand Russell further, and just keep engaging with this really fundamental, ongoing conversation between faith and reason.